Hey everyone, my name is Jonathan, and in this video what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to do VR interactions with Unreal just using the default template. So as you can see, I'm not in the default template for this. I just want to show you how we're going to do the interactions or what they'll look like at the end. And what we're going to cover is how to do something like the switch lever or the crank wheel, and that is passing information from our player, i.e. what hand we're grabbing and interactable with, and how we can modify that so we can grab something and then rotate it around like so. We won't be doing any hand snapping or anything like that, which you can see here, but we will be doing it so you can actually grab it, and then if you move down it actually turns light off. And we're going to go through these. So this will probably be two different videos. We'll do one for the switch lever and then one for the crank wheel, but overall the initial concept is the same between both. It all depends on the math that you're going to use. So what we're going to do is we're going to back out of this. I'm going to have my body hide any errors so you can't see them. And then we're going to close this one down and we're going to open up a brand new Epic VR template. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the virtual reality template from the games section. And then we're just going to give a file and then a project name. I am using 5.1, but it doesn't matter what version you use, the logic's all the same. Especially after 5.0.3. So don't worry about that. Pick the engine version you want and then just hit create. While this is loading up, I want to say a big shout out to all the Patreons for making this possible. They'll have your names up on the screen. And then if you want to support the channel, it'll be awesome if you head over there. You can actually get access to some pretty cool stuff. So now that we've loaded in, we're going to wait for these shaders to compile. Which is done. And then what we can do is we can actually take a look at how the template's set up. So the VR template has a file folder called VR template, and then in there is blueprints. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually focus some of our attention on the grab component which already exists. So if you don't know how this works, what happens is in the VR pawn, we have a section of code here for the left and right controller, which takes our input grip. So grab doesn't matter what controller you're using. And then when you press that, it starts and it gets the grab component near the motion controller. So we do that by getting a reference to the motion controller left in this case. And then in here, we create a sphere trace. So essentially a little bubble around the controller, which checks for actors that are inside of it. So an actor is something like one of these cubes that is inside the scene. And from here, we go through and we get that hit detected actor, which is what we're breaking from the sphere trace. And then we check to see if that has something called a grab component. And in this case, the grab component is this little thing here, which contains a whole bunch of code. So you can see a bunch of functions here. So try grab, try release. And this essentially goes from the player to the grab component to tell the actor that this is a part of, which we can see here. So you see the selected mesh has a grab component. This thing is attached to it as a child. What to do? And what this allows us to do is take information from our player, in this case our motion controller, which one we're grabbing with, send it through the grab component as a middleman, and then out into the grabbable cube. In this case, the grab component, what we can do with it is, you can see here on the right, we have this on grabbed, and this is an event dispatcher. So we press this, we can actually tell the blueprint to do something once we grab it. So this is what we're going to do, but we first need to do a couple of things. But before going through, what I want to do is I want to tell you a bit more about how this works. So we get the grab component from the mesh, which is essentially our middleman. And then we loop through it to see if there's multiple objects inside of our sphere trace that we're doing. If so, pick the one closest to the center of the hand. So it allows us to get our main one, and then we pass that through our return node. So we're essentially saying get the actor that has a grab component closest to the center of this sphere, and then we pass that through back to our event grab, which comes out this end for the nearest motion controller, or the nearest component, where we check to see if it's valid. If it is valid, it means there is something we can actually grab. If it's not, then we don't want to grab it at all, so we fire nothing. In there, we can reference the function try grab from that grab component because we know we've hit one. So when we grab the sphere trace, it gets our actor, it checks to see if there's a grab component. If it is, and it's true, it goes through and it fires the try grab function inside of the grab component. In this case here, so it goes to the try grab. We do our sequence, and sequences work from 0 to 1, so it'll go from the top line of code to the bottom line. So in this case, we have a grab type, which is on our actor. So grab component, free, snap, or custom. We will be creating a new one of these. And then we can go through and we can tell this code to do something. In this case, free and snap, they disable physics on the actor that we're attached to. And then we attach that actor to our motion controller hand, which is what allows us to pick it up. And then in the case of snap, we set the rotation and the location, followed by the branch to say if we're held, and then we call on grab. So this is the event dispatcher, which we can see here, which we'll be using to pass the information through to activate code within those levers, or the rotation dials, or a draw, or whatever the hell you want, it will pass through that. So hopefully that makes sense. Now we can go back to the VR porn. So once we've done this try grab information and we've told the actor what we're doing, or we're snapping it, we check to see if we've actually held an object, and if we do, we tell the player that we are currently holding a component in our left hand, or in the bottom case, the right hand. And this is why components are so cool, is because we can actually have the same thing here. So this component is exactly the same as this one, or the functions, and then it just checks to see if that component exists. And it doesn't matter what actor it's attached to, we can still read that. So that's a brief overview of how the grab component works with the player and then gets passed through to the actor. And what we're going to do is we're going to use that information to go from our player to our essentially grab component, to our actor, and then we're going to have it do some code. But before we do that, we need some meshes. We need something that we can actually grab and rotate around. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the ones from my GDXR template. However, if you do have access to the Epic content or the games launcher, which you should do, you can actually go in there and you can download the starter pack. So marketplace, and then I believe on here is the starter content folder. So it should be free by Epic. There is one in here. Let me find it. I'll pause. Inside of the content example. So it's inside the marketplace, or the samples is where I found it, and then content examples. We might actually just use this. So we'll create a new project. I will move it to 5.1. It doesn't really matter what version you're using. And then we're going to create. We'll wait for this to finish creating, and then we'll open up the project. I'm doing this just so I don't have to make some static meshes. If you've already got them, you'll be able to use those absolutely fine. So with that downloaded and open, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the maps folder and then blueprint communication. And at the end of the level, you can see we've got 3 blueprints here. What we want to do is take the valve and the meshes from that and the sliders as well. So you can do whichever one you want, but in this case we've got the wheel. I'm going to select the wheel and then just find that in the meshes folder. So we've got the crank wheel, and then crank base, and then interactive switch and interactive switch handle. What I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and I'm going to migrate those. So asset actions, migrate, take that entire folder. I'm going to put it into my project, which is on my desktop folder, pull lever, and then content file. And now with that selected, we can migrate those files to that project. So now if we close this down, we can close this window. And now what we'll have is a example content, blueprint communication, meshes, and we'll have those available to us to work with. So what we're going to do is we're going to create 2 new blueprints, and we'll keep these in here. We'll keep them together. Blueprint class actor. We're going to call this BP underscore crank wheel. And we'll start with the crank wheel itself. So we'll open this one up. And what we can do now is we can take these static meshes and we can bring them into our crank wheel blueprint. I'm going to just drag them on. So now that we have the meshes in the blueprint, what we want to do is we're going to set the interactive crank, which is the main body here. We can move it back a little bit, and we're going to set that as our default scene route. Oh, it'll move it forward. My bad. So interactive crank wheel is going to be a child. we can actually move that one forward a little bit. So it should look like this. What I'm going to do is in the static mesh, I'm going to open it up. And we've got a focus target, we don't need that. But what we do want to do is actually change the collision. So at the minute it's on block all, which is absolutely fine. What we want to do is set collision preset to overlap all. So that'll allow us to detect it. And then for the collisions, want to make sure that we've got a simple collision. This is way too much for what we want. We want to only grab the handle here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to collision, add box, simplify collision. I'm going to move this up. I'm going to put this collision just over the handle. So kind of move it around, reposition it. Got grid snap. Let's turn you off. So we have something like that. Oh. Why are we snapping? There we go. Cool. So now the handle is going to be what we can grab. We're going to ignore it if we grab anywhere else, but the handle is what we're going for. So with the collision set up on the wheel, we can go back to our crank blueprint and hit compile. And then we're going to leave this for a second. We're going to go to our grab component. So I've got mine already open in my tab, but if you can't remember, it's in our VR template folder, content blueprints, or VR template blueprints, and then we have the grab component here, and we'll also need our player VR pawn open as well. So inside the grab component, we want to go to the try grab function, which is here on the left, and you can see here that we actually get a reference to the motion controller. This is already set and it's got a motion controller reference for us, but what we're going to do is we're going to pass that through to our grab component. So or event dispatcher, sorry. So on grabbed, we want to select our event dispatcher. We're going to do new parameter, and for the actual variable, we're going to search for motion controller. So motion controller component, object reference, and we're going to name the variable motion controller. Like so. And now what we can do is we can actually pass that through. So we can hit compile. We'll get an error, but you can right click and then do refresh nodes. And we're going to plug that into our motion controller reference. So what we're doing here is from our player, so VR pawn, we get our motion controller. We pass that through to the grab component. Then from the grab component, we get the motion controller and we pass it through to our player, or the actor, sorry. So in here, we can add our grab component from our static mesh interactive crank wheel. We can press the add, search for grab component. And then in here, when we select on grab now, which is behind my head, I've got a feeling. When we press it, you can see that we actually get that motion controller reference passed through to the actor. So this is going to be what tells our player or actor what we're doing and what hand we're using, and this will fire our math. But before we can do that, we need to tell our actor that it's not going to be moved. We're not attaching it to our hand. So what we could do is we could use none. Plug that directly into is held variable. But what we can do is if you want to keep it night, we've got a grab type enumeration here. We can open this up and we can add new enumerator. And we can say static interactor or static interaction. Hit enter, save. And now in our grab component, you'll see that we actually have that static interaction. So we're going to plug that directly into set. So it does is held. And then we can go to compile. And now in our grab or in our crank wheel, if we select grab component, we can see on the right here that grab type can now be set to static interaction. So if we add a print string, and then we plug that to our motion controller, what we should be able to do is do compile, and then drag our blueprint that we've created into our scene, which is in our meshes folder. Just going to place it there for now. So when we go up to it, we should be able to hop in, teleport to it. When we grab it, we should be able to see a print string value up here. And you can see it's getting the motion controller right. And if we do the same with the left hand, we get the left controller. So now we know that our data is passing through it, and we're also not moving the object in the scene, so it's not attaching to our hand. So now we can actually code in the logic that we want to rotate. So in the crank wheel blueprint, what we're going to do is we're going to remove the print string. And I absolutely hate using event ticks. They're pointless. Not in some occasions. Don't take me, yeah, don't go after me for that. But what we're going to do is we're going to do timer. So when we grab the actor, only then do we calculate the information that we need. So when we release it with our other hand, it stops that code firing. So one, it's a bit more performant, and two, it's easier to work with. So for the onGrabbed, or actually what we'll do is start with a motion control. We'll create a variable. So we're going to right click, promote to variable, and then from that we're going to do set timer by event. I'm going to set this timer value to 0.02, make it buttery smooth, and then the looping we're going to set to true. From the event, we're going to do a custom event and say update rotation. So now is where things are going to get a whole bunch of confusing because we've got to do a whole bunch of math. So what we're going to do is we're going to get the world rotation of our motion controller, the world rotation of our crank wheel. We're going to do a find lookout rotation, a dot product, and then we're going to interpret that to our value. So this will make sense as we go through. I am looking at my example that I've got because I cannot remember the math off the top of my head. So first thing we do is we're going to take our crank wheel, we're going to drag this in, and we're going to take our motion controller variable, and we're also going to bring that in. We're going to do two gets, and we want to do get world location for both of these. So get world location, and then we want to do a find lookout rotation. So what we're doing is we start with the crank wheel in its specific location, and then we're going to rotate it to match the motion controller, which this is what we get out of here, the rotator. From this, we're going to get rotation X, so get rotation X vector, and we're doing this because our wheel is actually on that axis, so we're going to rotate it on our X axis. So if your mesh is in a different axis, you might have to use a different get rotation, but if you keep it with the X, then this should work fine for you. From here, we're going to do a dot product. Couldn't tell you what this really does, returns dot product of two vectors. I am not smart enough to tell you that. But what we want to do is feed into the bottom one, we want to get our motion controller. We want to get world rotation, get the right vector, and then plug that into our dot, like so. From here, we're going to normalize the axis, and then we're going to multiply it. So the normalize actually clamps the range, and then we want to multiply this by a value of 10. Don't know how I got 3 out of that. And now what we can do is we can set this up to do the actual rotation. So we're going to do an F interp2. So tries to reach the target based on distance from the current position, giving a nice smooth feeling when tracked. So what we're going to do is from the return value of our set timer, we're going to set up the delta time first. So get time elapsed by handle. Plug that into delta time. And for our target, we want to plug that into our multiply, like so. There's going to be some crossover with nodes, but it should be fine overall. So for the current, what we want to do is we want to actually set the return value, promote to a variable. So current, do current value, plug that into our update timer. And then we want to get the current value, even though I spelled it wrong, and plug that into our current. So once it's updated, we set it, and then this can call it back so it knows where we are, and then we can actually move to the new location. So interp speed, I have mine set to a value of 4, which I find quite nice. And from the current value, we want to make rotator. So we're taking this value and we're turning it into a rotation, and we want it on the X because that is the axis that we're actually rotating the valve on. And then we can add local rotation. So we could do that, add local rotation, and we want that for the crank wheel. So local rotation interact with crank wheel, plug that into the return value. So all we're doing here is we're keeping the original positions 0, 0, so Y and Z, and then we're only updating the roll rotation, which is exactly what we're after. We don't have to set anything for sweep or teleport, and that should be it for our main set of code to update. The problem is, right now, our timer doesn't finish when we let go. So if we were to test this out and we release the hand, it would still have that reference and it would still update the rotation. So in the grab component, once you've selected it, we also have a value for onDropped, so an event dispatcher. So onDropped, which we're passing through, we don't need a reference to our motion controller because we're actually just going to clear it. So get motion controller, set to clear, and then we want to do pause timer by function name. And in here we can copy this updated rotation because that is the timer we're going to stop. Function name. And then that should be it. So what I'll do is I'll make this a little bit longer for you so you can actually see what's going on. So essentially what we're doing is when we grab the collision area of our dial or rotational crank wheel, we start a timer which updates our local rotation. And we do that by getting the crank wheel world location and motion controller world location to find the look at rotation. So if we've got both of them together, the crank wheel will look at the motion controller, and we get the rotation X vector and the right vector of the motion controller into the dot product, which we normalize. From there, we multiply by 10. You can modify these values to change it how you'd like. And from these, we interpret between both locations. So the current position that it is, and then the target of where we're actually finding, where we're looking at, and then make the rotator go through to the add local rotation. After that, we drop it. So when we release the button on our controller, and then we pause the timer to stop it where it is. So if we jump in now, we should be able to go through, find our crank wheel once our controllers start up. And then once we get to it, we can grab it, and it's spinning around in random rotations. And I've realized my mistake. What I've done is the motion controller is getting the world rotation. It should be the crank wheel. So crank wheel, and inside the grab component for try release, we also need to make sure static interaction is set to is held, set to false. So now we hop back in, should be able to go up to our crank wheel, grab it, and you can see now it actually follows our hand based on where our controller is. So we can actually rotate it around. Awesome. Now we can do the same thing with the other hand. So now the question is, do you guys want to see how to actually get that information out? And that's more of a rhetorical question because I've got a feeling you're all going to say yes. Even though the video is getting on in length, don't think you won't mind. Cool, so what we can do is we can open up the crank wheel. And there's two ways that we can get information out of this blueprint. We could use an event dispatcher, which we could actually set up to go inside of a new blueprint. Or we can have a blueprint interface. So what we're going to do is for both of them, is for the event dispatcher, if you need this, what you can do is rotation, and then what we can do is from here we can do compile save. We can drag this in and we can call this value, and we can also make sure that we give it a float variable. So float, so crank value. We can plug that into our add local rotation. And the best way that I found to get information out of this is from interp2. If we do an absolute, we can plug that directly into our parameter. So you can see it hasn't updated. I can right click and refresh nodes, connect those back up. And now we can actually call this information from another blueprint. Or we can do an event dispatcher. So we can do blueprint class, not event dispatcher, blueprint interface. Blueprint interface, BPI underscore interactions. Open this up, and then we can have this as crank wheel value. We can do inputs, float, then crank wheel value. Call. And now inside of our crank wheel, we can actually go from the absolute, or we can just do search crank wheel value message and have these both plugged in like so. So now you have the event dispatcher to get information out if it's a child blueprint, and also the crank wheel blueprint interface, which you can connect an actor to. So right now we don't have a target actor, so we can right click and promote to variable, and then we can have this literally set to target. Instead of object, I'm just going to do actor, and then object types actor object reference. change variable. It's updating on my other monitor. And now we can make this public. So now this crank wheel can actually talk to any other blueprints in our level and pass this information through to it. So if we take this and we do a blueprint actor, so actor BP underscore crank value, we can open this up and we can give it the class setting, interface, blueprint interactions, blueprint interface interactions, hit compile, and then if we delete these, we can search for event crank wheel value, print string, and then bring that out. So we do compile and we drag that into the level. Doesn't matter where it is because it's only contained in a print string. We can select our crank wheel and we say the target actor is this crank value that's in our level. So now if we go into it, we can actually navigate over to the blueprint, and then when we grab it, we can actually feed that value in and we can get a number out of it. So so we can feed that in and use it to add up somewhere else for an amount. So that's pretty much it for setting up the crank wheel inside of Unreal. What we can do is we can take this as a step 2, and then I'll do a second part to the video which will cover how to create the lever. But it's actually very simple and it's pretty similar, to be fair. But if you want to get access to the files, make sure to head over to Patreon. They'll be there for you. You'll be able to have a download and play around with them, or just migrate this over to your project if you're starting out. Big thanks to everyone over there. Make sure to join the Discord, then we can help you out if you've got any questions. But until next time, stay safe and I'll see you then. Bye!